we're looking at here on how to organize a city actually comes from a quote that one of our panelists, Bill Fletcher, wrote with Fernando Capassin called Solidarity Divided, in which this question arose about why would you want to organize a whole city and how would you organize a whole city? Since I've been interested in urban questions most of my life, I thought I should have a little attempt at trying to find some answer to it. And I tried to do so in the book Rebel Cities. So not very successfully, but I think that the point of this panel was to actually go over that question a little bit further. Along with Bill, who is currently working with the American Federation of Government Employees. He's been in the union movement most of his life. He's also been a political commentator and a writer and researcher, and we're very happy that he can be an adjunct visiting scholar, or whatever the title is, to the Center for Place, Culture and Politics, which I direct. John Liss and Gihan Pereira, who are the other two people here, both have in common that they played a role in the creation of the Right to the City movement. Both of them ran worker centers, John in Northern Virginia, Gihan in Miami, and they've now gone on and expanded their interests to larger organizations. John is working with the New Majority in Virginia, and Gihan with the New Majority in Florida. Both of them have played a very important role in organizing people, mainly around community issues, but not exclusively so. So I thought one of the questions, of course, is what's the relationship between labor organizing and community organizing, particularly at the level of the city. So we invited the three practicing organizing, organizing practicing experience to come and talk a little bit on this theme. Each of them will talk for some 20 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion between us, and then open it up to a conversation with people in the audience. So maybe we could start with Bill, and then we'll go on from there, across the table from there.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you very much. Good evening. Is this working? Okay, good. John and Gihan and I talked briefly before this, and there's different components of this question that we wanted to tackle. I just want to lay out a few points to provoke a discussion. So I want to start with this question about why cities, but specifically understanding when we're talking about the right to the cities, that there's really two kinds of cities with purposes of organizing and building power. One are the major metropolitan areas, which is, I think, what most people think about in terms of urban social movement. But there are other cities that we on the left need to be paying attention to, and those are what I call the dead cities. What are the 21st century reservations for immigrants and for redundant populations. And the United States has many of these dead cities. And there's few people on the left that actually have any kind of strategy focused on it. The dead cities, they're sort of no-go zones, like Camden, New Jersey, or places like Flint, Michigan, that have been witnessing the steady erosion of its industrial base. East St. Louis, Bellflower, California. you see the rise of these dead cities, and what has happened is that there are various attempts to rejuvenate them, in some cases slightly more successfully than others, places like Fall River, Massachusetts. There's experiments with creating waterfront areas for tourists, but by and large, these are areas that have been identified to move populations that the dominant segments of capital don't want in the cities anymore, in the major metropolitan areas. And so we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years, not only gentrification, that is the racial and ethnic cleansing of the cities, we've seen populations that are moving into the United States instead of the traditional route of going into a major metropolitan area, building a community, whatever. Instead, being shuttled out. They get moved to Brockton, Massachusetts, for example. It's like, don't stop in Boston, do not collect $200, go straight to Brockton, go straight to New Bedford, and other places. So part of what that means is that we've got to think, when we're talking about urban movements and fight for power and strategy, that we need to be thinking about different strategies depending on whether it's a major metropolitan area or one of these no-go zones. And with regard to that, particularly in these dead cities, there's a dire need for the development of survival programs and alternative economic development strategies, because they are areas where their private capital has no particular interest in investing. And as a result, there's no particular base that ends up getting developed. So that was point number one that I wanted to make. The second point that I wanted to make is when you start looking over the years at various efforts at urban reform, there are a couple of problems that keep popping up that we on the left need to be thinking about as we go forward. One is single-issue reform efforts, and the second is over-reliance on a great hero or heroine. By single issues, what I mean is that there have been movements over the years to try to tackle the transformation of the cities, the cleansing of the cities, and whether it's issues around rent control or other such efforts, but they are not connected to an overall fight for power. And then you have various fights for power that are particularly like mayoral candidacies that have taken place. And they run against a very interesting problem. And I'm thinking particularly about examples like Richard Hatcher, Coleman Young, who were mayors of Gary, Indiana, and Detroit, Michigan, respectively. Then you have some similar problems that were faced by Harold Washington. And that is that you have people that are progressive that get elected. And I think actually fairly well-intentioned progressives. Coleman Young at one point had a connection to the Communist Party. Richard Hatcher was certainly a social democrat of some sort. And they had in mind some sort of transformation of their respective cities. But what they didn't have, even though they had a personal base, they didn't build a social movement base for the transformation of their respective cities. And I distinguish those characters from, those individuals from people like Marion Barry, who was an urban populist, but of a different brand. So they didn't have movements, and one of the problems that they ran up against was something that Coulantzas talked about in his final book, State, Power, and Socialism, which is the nature of power, which becomes very, very clear when you look at these examples, that power is not something that is solid. It's more like a bubble that moves around, that there's no institution that is permanently invested with power. So that under certain conditions, and this is something that Harold Washington ran up against, being the mayor of a city seems to bring with it automatic power. But all of a sudden, Harold Washington was elected, and presto, the power that he thought that he had as mayor was gone and was relocated into the city council. Coleman Young and Richard Hatcher faced similar challenges, and power morphed and moved to the state level. So one of the things that's important there's actually two critical lessons. One is the need for urban social movements that are driving these transformational efforts and are more than just about putting in place great individuals. But the second is an additional strategic problem, which is that we've got to think ultimately at the state level. Because if power moves out of the urban center and ends up in the hands of the state legislatures, the question is, what do we do? If we win control of New York, if working people win control of New York, but all of a sudden power is vacuumed away and ends up in Albany on critical things, urban economic development, for example, what then do we do? So it's not just about seizing one city at a time. We've got to be thinking in more critical mass. And in thinking about that, the issues of strategy, one of the things that Gapasina and I have been advocating, is the notion of the need for working people's agenda and working people's assemblies. And simply put, that in fighting the fight for power in cities, we've got to build a strategic bloc of forces that actually have a long-term interest in the transformation of the cities. Not simply putting a new person in office, not minor reforms, but really thinking at a larger structural reform level. My final point, union movement, which is what I am in, and as David mentioned, I've been part of since getting out of college. The union movement really does not have a theory for organizing the cities. It doesn't conceptualize the organizing of the cities. It did at one point. In the 19th century, in the development of the union movement, cities were very important. And part of that was because production was very much based in cities and counties. Central labor councils were critical institutions. But by the 20th century, for a whole host of reasons, that became less the case. And unions focused less and less on the issue of citywide power. They did focus and have focused on citywide elections, lobbying, etc., but very little thinking about working people gaining power at the citywide level. And this is directly connected to a problem that's built into the union movement, which is the disconnect that exists between the union as an institution and the fight for economic justice. So insofar as unions broke that in the late 1940s in the aftermath of the Cold War witch hunts, and unions focused very much on unions as institutions and taking on more and more the form of a lobby, they ceased to be real movements for economic justice or creating such movements, and they ceased to think at the level of what do we need to do at the citywide level, countywide level, etc., to really rediscover, rebuild, or create power for working people. And so I would argue that ends up being perhaps one of our biggest challenges right now. Thank
you. Good evening. I'm John Liss with Virginia New Majority, and I've spent most of the last 30-odd years organizing in Virginia. I want to give some background because I think it sort of reflects on the possibilities in terms of what we would try and do in Virginia around this question. So first of all, Virginia has a Dillon Rule, which is a legacy of the Old South. So localities are not allowed to do anything unless expressly given that power by the state. So basically, you have disempowered urban areas or cities. That's one. Two is, even though in the last two presidential elections, it's gone in favor of Obama, it's really controlled by Republican legislatures, which drew the lines. So a state that is roughly, because of demographic transformation, is roughly 50-50, is 2/3 Republican at the state legislative level. So it really limits the power that's given to localities and limits what you need to do at the state level. So that's sort of the background. And the other thing is, part of the South, there is a historic disinvestment in terms of social justice and social justice infrastructure, which means there aren't very many community-based organizations. You probably have more in a block here in New York City than we have in the whole state. Secondly, along the same line, union density is in the 3 to 4% range. So again, it's very different than I think it's here in New York and elsewhere. I will say that, I mean, unions, despite being that small, you know, they have overdetermined power in terms of their sort of electoral capacity. So that's sort of the background. Again, I come out of 30 years of organizing in 2 neighborhoods, and our critique of that work was that we won many great victories. 300-unit housing cooperative that was part of our response to the bank bailouts in the early 90s was taken over by the community, living wage ordinance, dual language schools, a whole range of victories, but we saw the limits of what we could do with the locality and the scale that we did that with. So we were working by the end with 12, 13 staff and doing 2 communities intensives, 2 immigrant, mostly Latino, mostly Central American communities. We were organizing with 13 full-time staff. So to try and magnify that or get beyond that scale, we would need, I don't know, 500 or 600 organizers for the whole state. So we didn't have that financial capacity. And so part of the concept behind the New Majority work is how can we jump scales? Can we go from the local to the state? And how can we do that sort of more efficiently? And how can we leverage large-scale electoral work on one hand, and then come back in and do the development of conscious leaders who can actually transform the state beyond the sort of electoral alternatives. So that's sort of the backdrop. And then so we can't really organize in the city per se. We're so limited legally and structurally about what can happen, but we can organize in the urban. So in Virginia, it's called the Urban Crescent. It basically runs from Tidewater, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, through Richmond, up into Northern Virginia. And it's roughly 70% of the state. It's pretty close to majority people of color, large working class population, and that's where we do our work. So it's the urban that we work. And we look at our work, as the name would imply, New Majority. We're trying to build a new majority. So I want to go through sort of who we see and what we think about in terms of constructing that new majority. You know, we would use sort of Gramsci's term of historic bloc. So what's the ensemble of class or class, race, and gender forces that we're bringing together that can actually sort of run the state, if you will. So for class, one thing I would add in, and some of you all were upstairs when we had this pre-conversation, so some of this won't all be new, but some of the stuff around class is what's the relationship of working class white folks to the new economy? Because we think that has a big shift in terms of how people vote and how people think, people's understanding of the role of government in the state. So like in Mississippi, where 90% of all white voters voted for Romney, in Virginia it was much more 50-50. In the areas that we worked, it was way more than 50-50, and that's because folks are government workers, are idea workers, are new economy workers. We think, again, that's making a difference over time. Secondly, it's race. So we start off, we're in the South, you start off with the northern edge of the Black Belt. So 19% of Virginia's population is African American, and that's, you know, from Tidewater to Richmond, that's really sort of where that population is concentrated. And even though demographics isn't destiny, over the last 25 years, there's been an infusion of Asian and African American and African folks, particularly in northern Virginia. And again, that's where the other sort of block of people are coming in. So we view race, class, and class race is really important in terms of how we do our work. It's become clear that sexuality and gender is also a key electoral sort of mobilizer and understanding that we're trying to put out there in terms of how we're organizing. In part, I guess our enemies pick sort of who to go after. In the last couple of years in Virginia, you all have the transvaginal ultrasound requirement for women had abortion. That was a Virginia sort of initiative. Anti-gay legislation has been an initiative. So that sort of helped us to mobilize in communities that, you know, that sort of picked our battle for us, if you will. Spatially, following up on sort of what Bill was saying, it's important, I guess, I think the other would call it a spatial fix, is that basically instead of people concentrated in sort of what used to be called the inner suburb, people moved out to, you know, jokingly called it the Cracker Belt. It was like the outer part of the city where 25, 30 miles out, and that was the zone where all the racial and anti-immigrant conflict was over the last 10 years. That's also where really the population growth has been, and that's really urban. So to think of that as the whole old hypothesis around rings and all that, it really is urban. I mean, unfortunately, I've seen Times Square. We got the same shopping malls as you guys got there. So it's a different approach, and it's been a real challenge for us as organizers is how do you do organizing when folks are 25 to 30 miles out, and it's, you know, if you take your protractor, it's a much wider, it's a lot more driving because there's not really mass transit to get you around there. So especially we're really looking at outer suburbs around our urban areas as key areas to go after. And then again, I'll come back to the scale question. So doing voter work, just on the organizer level, when you do traditional organizing, you're talking to somebody, you're spending, knocking on the door or wherever you may be, you're spending 20 minutes having a conversation, developing a relationship, getting a political understanding of how to move somebody. When you're doing voter organizing, you're training someone 3 days and they're out on the door and they're spending 2 minutes talking to somebody. So the downside is you don't develop a deep relationship. The good side is that we're talking to 150,000 people in the course of one electoral cycle. Under traditional organizing, it might have taken us 20 years to get there, or 10 years or something like that. So our scale has gone up, but the challenge remains, how do you move people sort of ideologically, politically, you know, and to some extent, what extent can you substitute internet, communications, and some level of leadership development, trying to develop leadership clusters or cores around the city, around the state. Moving to the next piece, I wanted to talk about, there was a question around sort of institutional possibilities, and I just sort of follow up and sort of agree with Bill on, you know, is there some sort of working people's assemblies? Is that a framework? I would say potentially, it depends on how desperate and open to change unions become, but our Central Labor Council is a place where you can do left regroupment and do community regroupment. Can you open that up and have folks from community groups, service groups, traditional legacy sort of civil rights organizations come in the same place and sort of talk out people's agendas for the region or for the state. So there are possibilities there. There's the beginning of an infrastructure. Again, one of the advantages of electoral work is you do have access to a lot more data. So we know whose house we're visiting. We can have ideology models, race and gender models. So we pretty much know income models. We can tell whose door we're knocking on and sort of group people together on a bigger scale. So that's again, institutionally we come together at what's called state tables at the state level, different 501c3, 501c4, legal categories. And so that's another place where we come together and sort of think out power at the state level. There was a, and I think there's an ongoing question, and it was posed earlier today, just in terms of the relationship of formal intellectuals in our state with our movement, and I think it's a general movement question, how do we sort of break down some of those walls and have sort of engaged formal academy, if you will, with community organizing, organizing for power, how do you sort of take and have engaged inquiry and work and product that actually relates to what we're trying to do on the ground. So there's some small possibilities there. The other question we had going in was, is this naturally anti-capitalist? So yeah, and I'm not really comfortable with that sort of framing. So it's like, you know, I'm not a Christian or I'm not real religious. So if I describe myself as anti-Jesus, probably not. So I think there's other ways. What are we for? And I think that's where it gets sort of interesting, because what we're trying to do is move from an electoral majority, if you will, when Obama wins the election by 50,000 votes in the state of Virginia, to a political majority, which is how I characterize people having a common understanding of how the world works and how we want it to work and how we want to change it. And that's a much higher bar, but I think that's what we're really trying to struggle over and move. So it's around, and these are just sort of a list of some of the questions that I think that we talk about on the doors in a variety of different ways. So one is around reproductive rights, access to healthcare rights, social wage broadly. So I think those are things, people don't think of that in terms of socialism or what have you, but people actually do look for ways to get their needs covered, and access to healthcare was huge. We did a 6-month campaign around accepting Medicaid expansion that finally got through in Virginia. That's one example. Secondly is around public employees. So there's this whole myth around the private sector economy. You know, we have Republican governors and folks who sort of run that through. But 20% of Virginia employees are public sector. And so I think there's a unique sort of way that can turn together, that if we're demanding a social aid, which is publicly provided, whether it's healthcare, quality education, what have you, it can be turned around, who provides that? You know, and how do we get the highest quality possible, what we really deserve? So, and how do you challenge the myth of it all being really private market? Again, I talked earlier about sort of working class and new sectors of the working class. I would argue that part of our work is coming up with demands that also link with some of the more modernizing sector capital. So what does that mean in terms of who's supporting higher education, more investment in secondary and college education, the high-tech sector, et cetera? I think that's a piece of some of the demands that we want to put forward. And lastly, sort of an area that we think we're experimenting with, but we think it's both important because the world's going to burn up in terms of climate change, but it also gives us an opportunity for alliance building, has been talking about climate and relating that to transportation and relating that to sprawl, and having to start talking about that in a way that could actually build that, again, the new majority. And one thing that's been interesting has been, you know, we mapped out, like what happened with Sandy, if it had been, a little hiccup in the other direction, it would have happened in Chesapeake Bay. And we mapped out all the areas that are 10 feet or less above sea level, which, interesting, is one of the few areas in the state that have become more white over the years, over the last 10 years, since the last census. And that's, basically behind beach homes. So the point is, there's opportunities for sort of multi-sector, multi-class organizing partly around a frame of the environment and sort of the whole organization of suburban sprawl life and the link to a transportation crisis that is also being entertained. The last piece that really, I just want to sort of try and bring it together here is a question, and it's Martha Harnica has posed it in a number of ways. It's a question of a political instrument. It's which I guess in the old days would have been called a party, right? But it's like, what is the kind of body that can be brought together where you can have folks who are doing different kinds of organizing to sort of bring together some level of historical memory, to have sort of cross-sector conversation, coordination between organized labor, immigrant rights, legacy African-American civil rights, or Black liberation. Where does that happen? And it really doesn't. It happens ad hoc. And if our side doesn't have higher levels of coordination, thinking, and strategy, we will continue to work very hard, do great individual work, and go backwards every couple of years. So that's what we're, so I think there is a need for some kind of political instrument, again, using that terminology. And I think that, it could be as simple as partly it's coming up with the frame and the messaging, and how do we talk about what we're trying to get. It's about strategic intelligence and planning, and then, again, coordination. So I think that's one of the challenges for us, is figuring out what is the right vehicle to sort of create that. And I think that's a challenge for all of us. Thanks.
So thanks. I'm glad we're having this conversation. Folks hear me? I think, for one is, I think that this entire discussion is really a question of, for all of us, how do we actually see what's happening in the world, politically what's doing, and what's the set of experiments that we've been taking on to actually build a real transformative movement at local and bigger scales. And I say experiments because I think one is a recognition that we actually aren't in a state of strong left or strong social movements that are actually the power to build. And in fact, the old models that we've had, both around political organization and building organized power, are in a real transition, and we haven't figured out what's next. So all of this is in some ways in the spirit of trying to recognize that and move to what is a next level of political movement and transformation that could be possible. And so for me, I've generally tried to look at that question and just kind of go up to my head in the storm, right, and say, well, let's just get right into the heart of the contradiction and try and figure out what works and what doesn't work. Starting with, leaving the Bay Area and moving to Georgia to organize textile workers, or from moving from a movement of organizing dispossessed folks to trying to figure out the Democratic Party and electoral politics in Florida. So the question is kind of like, just how do we look at the stuff and actually get into the heart and not play with it, but play with it in the most serious sense of actually trying to figure out what it takes to win. And in that context, I think if we talk about cities, for me, you know, the starting point is, well, what is happening to cities now, right, at a global scale in the United States? And I think Bill hit on some of it, so there's some basics about why we're even talking about cities. And for me, you know, one is, you know, 70%, and I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but increasingly 80% or something, towards 80% in the next few years, the entire global population will be living in cities, which is a drastic change from where we had largely an agricultural base worldwide economy with some industrial base in the cities or commercial base in the cities, where the actual population of people in the planet are organized and live in cities. And so that's true globally, has been true and increasingly true in the United States and true within our states. So there's one, just a demographic reality of the importance of cities. Secondly, you know, when in classic Marxist sense, you know, the relationship of the economy was really looked at between labor and capital. And I think when Henry Lefebvre first kind of started theorizing about the right to the city, and Western Marxists started really saying that the place that the labor-capital relationship was playing out was actually at the city scale, right, around how not just workers and bosses relate in companies or in factories, but how social reproduction happens in cities, so that, you know, how housing and the urban space is produced, and how the economy and the social relationships are created within an urban scale is actually really determinative of what society looks like, not just the relationship between particular workers and their employers. And so there's a framework around that that is important in terms of looking at the city in some ways like factory. Then I think the third thing is we are now in a place where it's not just the city, but we're actually in a particular place in global capitalism marked by neoliberalism. And neoliberalism and globalization has really changed the nature around which cities play in the global economy. And it changes it happened at the same time that global capitalism had went into deep crisis. So that cities, and this is a lot of what David has theorized on, cities have also been the place where capital has been able to pinch out new forms of capital accumulation, essentially by dispossessing people and repossessing things that were previously held in common. And so what we're seeing in cities then is a battle to basically, battles over dispossession and legitimization. And so it's in those places that basically austerity programs, the cuts in services, all of those things are playing out in cities and cities in the way that they are organized and the role that they play in the global economy are the sites of how the global economy is organized. Bill talked about insurgents, dead cities and live cities. It's also, that is playing out in the function of where, there's rapid deindustrialization in parts of the American Midwest and Northeast, which moved south to the south part of the United States and has moved further south into the global south since then. And new forms of new economies have started to take root in particular regional formations in the United States. And so then that has, within cities, then really created new forms of economic social relations and new forms of citizenship. In a sense, partial citizenship, as people have migrated and as previous populations have held jobs, particularly African American communities have largely been dispossessed both of economic security and jobs as deindustrialization has happened, but also of citizenship, from basic citizenship rights. And, we see that in Florida acutely as the struggle for basic political rights has actually been under attack consistently. So then when we talk about taking over the city, we're talking about how they actually look at that and make sense of that. And so it's a couple of things. In Florida, for example, the demographic reality is that 70% of the 78% of the state's population lives in 5 urban regions. The majority of that is people of color, but it does not, it's not reflected in political power or political rights. And if we look about then, well, then how do we transform that situation? We're actually talking about addressing both the question of how citizenship and political participation is structured in cities, and how the economy and the rights over how the economy is, both the economy and the political economy is shaped in those cities. And what I wanted to kind of talk about in looking at that is that most of the movements that I've been involved in the community movements, in the political movements, has really tried to, at its core, organize the people who have been most impacted and dispossessed by what's happening in the cities. So low-wage workers, poor folks, public housing residents, welfare recipients, ex-felons and criminals, who are subject to criminalization, young people who've been pushed out of the education system, LGBT and queer folks who've been socially marginalized, particularly women and women workers, domestic workers, and others, all who are essentially the dispossessed from kind of what is a developing city political economy. Those movements have largely been movements of opposition and protest, and to be able to actually give leadership and voice to the dispossessed, to call for either inclusion or transformation of those cities that actually exclude them. And what we've been trying to figure out as we've been getting serious about, well, what does it take to then actually control and take power of a city, is how do those movements of the dispossessed, which have the strength, kind of moral, they morally expose what's happening in the cities, bring out the greatest contradictions, and really, through the leadership of all of those folks I talked about, have the most interest in a transformed city, but in a transformed economy. How do they deal with the actualities of what power looks like in taking power? And to actually, for those movements to take power, they invariably have to figure out how to build relationships with more of what I'll call validated or legitimated institutional progressive actors, right? So then in order to win power because they don't have the right to vote, or they don't have resources in their institutions, or other forms of power, though they have to then figure out how to ally with labor in particular, with the parts of the Democratic Party apparatus, with allies that have resources. And so when those dispossessed movements try and figure out how to build alliances with validated movements and build rights for themselves, then those for me are the questions of how does that pathway look like? And the experience has been one very difficult in a way, because a lot of the power of the dispossessed movements get devalued and devalidated when it comes into relationship to more powerful resource and formally politically powerful organizations and institutions. So one of the key questions is, how is the relationship of power between the dispossessed movements and what I'll call the validated institutions and movements actually put together in a way that doesn't actually lose the agency of the dispossessed. Because once that happens, the transformative nature and demands quickly go away, because the validated institutions' self-interests generally tend to be more narrow than the more transformative demands of the dispossessed. And so in our work, we've really tried to figure out how do you build the organization and leadership of the dispossessed, so that when they relate to the traditional institutions, that they don't get wiped out and washed out, while recognizing the need to make those kinds of alliances. And in some ways, that plays out most specifically in trying to figure out how to do electoral work. What we've been trying to do in the New Majority Experiment in Florida is essentially how do we build a political power second thing is then that, to make that happen, there's a couple of things that we found are necessary, right? I think it's not just a question then of, bringing the folks together in a coalition and figuring out how to have solidarity with each other. Because a simple form of solidarity and coalition actually doesn't address the power differentials in a way that actually makes it operationally work. So we very quickly have come to, if there isn't actually a front point where there's some basic analysis and sense of self-interest that can be achieved, you actually will have to be, the result of practically trying to build coalitions will actually fall apart, and and essentially the more powerful will win out, and the dispossessed part of the equation will be even more dispossessed. And so, in our experiences with trying to, for example, really figure out our relationship with labor institutions in the state, we've really in tried experiences, experiments, unless we really build and come in with strong organization of the dispossessed, and unless those labor institutions can really be struggled with to actually, at the level of analysis, right? Because they're in crisis too, but they're in crisis and think they can get themselves out of it. And so there has to be actually work at the kind of ideological power analysis and in some ways existential level for people to actually surrender towards a new form of partnership. And that has to be work that's done at leadership and political education work, in fact, with time for the movements to actually engage with each other, part of which is to recognize what each other brings to the table in terms of power, right? The labor is in dire problems and in decline. It's 2% of the private sector in Florida, 9% overall. Its decline is kind of inevitable unless it finds a new form of organization and allies. But, and it is universally depicted as being self-interested and can't build alliances on its own. And needs partners to give it moral validity. And that's what movements of community folks and dispossessed movements can provide. But quite often, because those movements don't control resources, power, and money, they actually end up being tokenized rather than actually ending up in a peer and equitable relationship. And so, what we're trying to figure out is then how do you actually engage in a way where the power that dispossessed movements actually bring, which is moral power, power of vision, and actually a potential power of scale, all of which the labor and judicial institutions, including the Democratic Party, severely lack. Unless that power is recognized and there's some sense of that and structured that way, we actually won't be able to have successful alliances that can break through. If we can get to that, then I would agree with what Bill said. It also then calls for new forms of organizations where movements of the dispossessed and movements of the legitimated power institutions actually have a form to actually build together and actually demand something outside of their own issue or institutional basis. And so whether there be worker assemblies or worker community assemblies, there are, I think part of this is imagining what those spaces are, which are both spaces for building different types of relationships and analysis, but also for actually operationalizing demands at scale on a city and urban level. And so, that starts by actually figuring out how do you bring people together and take them through processes to actually look at power and the balance of forces at a regional level together, and then to actually start developing common frameworks, demands, and potential synergy. So that, kind of looks like analysis, solidarity, action, and it has to play out at the regional level and power at the city level what we want. And then, if that's the case, then I think we found, what John's found in Virginia, that it's very hard, even though we're moving from neighborhood to urban scale, to actually do it for real. You actually have to, in most places, figure out how you also have a statewide strategy. In Jacksonville, Florida, the city, the power structure created a city-county structure that diluted the black vote and made it impossible to actually wield political power for African Americans, right? And so, and in the state of Florida, essentially, and if you look throughout the country, what the right has done, it's actually in the face of potential political concentration of progressive forces in cities, has increasingly moved political decisions to the state level and actually waged ideological and policy fights at the state level, particularly around tax and revenue issues, that actually undermine the possibility of building power and a model of democracy in cities, because basically the cities get the carpet and the power swept, pulled from underneath them once there's some ambition to take power within them. So it forces us to actually think about how to get ahead of that curve, so we don't actually take power of us, take ownership of a sinking ship. And what that's looked like for us in Florida is actually, we have 5 regions in Jacksonville, Tampa, Orlando, South Florida, that we're building in. Each of those regions has a different political economy in a way, but we have to figure out how to actually build regional power in each of those that actually over time can express state power. And that's